Canada has long fancied itself a moral superpower whose diplomatic heft hugely outweighs the economic and military might it brings to international relations. This may once have been true, but in my estimation, it is no longer. Why? Because diplomacy is not an end in itself, but rather a means. Global Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly may think that Canada's ability to convene others is our greatest strength. But the value of convening isn't getting people around the table, but what comes out of bringing the convened together. So, if we have doubts whether Canadian diplomacy is all it is cracked up to be, the question we must ask is what ends Canada is trying to achieve. If we get what we want, then the means are good. If we don't get what we want, then the means that we are using are failing us. Now, the effectiveness of diplomacy as a means to Canada's goals is worth thinking about for a moment. Diplomacy relies by its nature on words and persuasion. So as a means, it relies on the existence of other parties willing to listen to what you have to say and open, at least in principle, to being persuaded. In the absence of these conditions, diplomacy will be essentially useless. So if you think Canadian diplomacy is less effective than it once was, you might want to ask yourself if that's because we are now dealing with a lot of people, think China and Russia, who do not share our values and presuppositions, and in fact think that much of what we worked so hard to build up in the post-war years, things such as the UN, multilateralism, the international rule of law, and free trade, these are not a shared baseline for discussion. On the contrary, what we have achieved is exactly what they want to dismantle. The liberal international order and its institutions are an obstacle to their ambitions in Ukraine and Taiwan, in the Arctic, and elsewhere. Moreover, since they don't believe in the rule of law or the inviolability of national sovereignty, unless it's their own sovereignty, of course, they will employ means against us in the pursuit of their objectives, against which words will be quite ineffectual. If they're willing to kidnap our citizens and hold them hostage, if they're willing to intimidate our politicians through threats to their families, or if they're willing to corrupt the institutions by which our society makes decisions in order to weaken our ability to pursue our own interests, diplomacy is no shield against them doing so. So, for the means of diplomacy to work for Canada in the pursuit of our national interest, several conditions must be met. Above all else, we must have the moral and intellectual fortitude and wherewithal to be able to define our interests, including the integrity of our institutions and our belief in the value of our society. And I would submit that for the past 30 years, we have been failing this test, and the failure is accelerating. Unless Canada is willing to purge its institutions and its political class of their subservience to the interests of nations that do not share our values, our diplomacy will continue to lose effectiveness. Moreover, as a large middle power, not a superpower, Canadian diplomacy will be quite useless on its own. Middle powers must seek to unite like-minded powers to pursue shared interests in concert. Yet all around us, the evidence is that other middle powers, Australia, Japan, Korea, the UK, India, and others, are working to build new architectures and institutions to allow them to work in concert to face down the bullies against whom diplomacy alone is ineffective. Yet Canada has so allowed its stock to fall as a friend and ally in the Liberal Democratic camp that we are not even invited to the table to be part of these conversations. AUKUS, the Quad, the Indo-Pacific Economic Bloc, to name but a few. If the recently leaked national security documents in the United States are to be believed, Canada is no longer regarded as a trustworthy ally with whom to share intelligence gathered on our adversaries. We have been asked by our partners to put ourselves on the line in making the bullies understand that their bad behavior will have hard consequences. Yet in public, we undertake, say, to meet the NATO 2% goal of GDP on defense spending. But when the doors are closed, our Prime Minister tells these vital allies that we will never honor these promises. We won't even spend the money needed to be the peacekeeping power that we aspire to be, and thanks to which we believe we bolster our diplomatic power. The result is, no one really wants us on their team, we are not trusted, and bullies believe they can push us around and pay no attention to our words. So in conclusion, I'd say that our challenge is not that Canada has ceased to be a moral superpower and master diplomatist. It is not that the means diplomacy makes available to us are no longer valuable. The problem lies elsewhere. We have forgotten what our interests are. We have forgotten that we have to be a friend to get a friend, and we have forgotten that words are a supplement to and not a replacement for hard power. When we relearn these lessons, our diplomacy will be refreshed and reinvigorated, and Canada really will be back. I'm Brian Lee Crowley for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute.